Alright, folks. So, we got an upcoming unification this weekend at the light heavyweight division, which has started to finally heat up again, really for the first time since 2019, where both of who you would consider to be the number one and number two guys in the division picked up big wins around that time period. Now it's starting to heat up again. Really, I'd say it's starting to heat up to the highest extent, to its highest temperature, if you will, since the days of Kovalev and Stevenson, when Kovalev fought Ward and unified with Hopkins and whatnot. And that's good for the division, of course. And we're going to be getting some closure in regards to a unification which has been basically in the making for the past year and a half, between Artur Beterbiev, the WBC and IBF champion at the division, and Joe Smith Jr., the WBO champion. Beterbiev, Joe Smith has been a professional longer than Beterbiev, but Beterbiev has been a world champion longer. Beterbiev was someone who came out of the amateurs with a lot of hype, but was definitely of advanced age. I want to say he was 32 years old when he first won his world title against Enrico Colling. And then when he unified against Alexander Volstik and knocked him out, he was 34 years old, and now he's 37 years old, finally about to attempt to pick up his third title. So he's definitely going to have to get these big fights very quickly before he starts to decline even more precipitously. Joe Smith, in his case, is early 30s, 31, 32, something like that. First really came on the scene, he was fighting around club level, in New York on certain star boxing cards. But he made his first appearance on a PBC card when he knocked out Andres Fonfara in the first round after Fonfara had come off of a win against, I believe, Chavez Jr., I think? Right, yeah. And Fonfara had also had those fights with Adonis Stevenson. So Joe Smith came into that fight, and of course he was the underdog in that fight, and he managed to knock out Fonfara in the first round. And that was really his first introduction onto the real, relatively high stage sort of boxing arena. And then he fought against a geriatric Bernard Hopkins, let's be honest. But of course a Bernard Hopkins who was on the comeback trail to an extent, was 51 years old, but was nevertheless favored to beat Joe Smith. And Joe Smith pretty much whooped his ass, knocked him out, and sent him through the ropes, which became basically the defining moment of his career from that point pretty much forward. Probably still is. Joe Smith would earn certain big fights. He'd get a Sullivan-Barrera fight in which he'd get his jaw broken. He'd get a world title fight with Beterbiev, in which he would be thoroughly dominated. He'd land a big right hand in round 10. Okay? Otherwise, he was basically completely outclassed. So he had to basically rebuild his career from there. He's improved certainly since then. He's added new tools to his repertoire, or advanced certain tools in his repertoire. His jab has gotten better. He's learned how to double it up and cut the ring off a bit better and be a much more proactive fighter than he once was, which was a more sort of a crude slugger. And while he definitely does still retain those qualities that he possessed, certainly from the beginning of his career, as a sort of a strong, crude guy who kind of goons out certain fights, he's definitely added a more technical aspect to his game. He's improved his defense in terms of his ability to roll shots in the pocket, hooks coming in over the top, but he does struggle still to defend straight punches, and his footwork is still not very tight. But he started to improve and add more tools to his game, which proved to be vital. He would fight against Jesse Hart. I believe this was actually the fight directly after Beterbiev. He fought Jesse Hart. I believe he was the underdog against Hart, and he thoroughly dominated Hart to a split decision victory, which was just nonsensical. a fight where he virtually won every round, bar maybe one or two. A judge managed to score the fight for Hart, and Smith was... He intimidated Hart from early. I believe he floored him, and Hart basically just took off on his bike for the rest of the fight. Had nothing for him. Joe Smith would also fight against Eleider Alvarez in his next fight, who I believe was also favored to beat him, and he would end up completely dismantling and stopping Eleider Alvarez as well, who himself didn't really show the best form. His previous fight against Seals, he scored a highlight reel knockout, but certainly showed slippages in regards to his foot speed, and I believe he was around 37 years old at the time. So Joe Smith, in my opinion, at that time, even though he was definitely still a very high-ranked light heavyweight and had definitely rebuilt himself to an extent and earned a title shot, he still needed more to prove. And he got his opportunity to prove more to me by fighting the ex-cruiserweight contender, who then eventually moved on to light heavyweight, picking up scalps against Isaac Chilemba. And this would have been Maxim Vlasov, who he challenged for the vacant WBO light heavyweight title. Vlasov was initially supposed to fight Umar Salamov in an eliminator to fight for the vacant title, but that ended up not materializing, and they actually set it up straightforward. He tested positive for COVID. They pushed the fight back to April, and they put on an absolute war. Vlasov, for the most part, outworked Joe Smith. And in my opinion, I do maintain that while I had the fight, I believe 6-6 at the time I initially scored it, I do feel like I was scoring a bit generously for Joe, and I do think he was definitely generous to get the decision. But Joe Smith did definitely show a lot of grit in that fight. He managed to hurt Maxim Vlasov down the stretch, which managed to, bank him in some incredibly crucial rounds in the championship rounds. He was able to oftentimes use his defense, use his newly acquired roll in the pocket to be able to slip and evade and dodge hooks or roll with them. And Vlasov was incapable of hurting him on a regular basis, and though his stamina was definitely seemed to look like it was failing him, as he actually alluded to in that segment of Blood, Sweat, and Tears, Vlasov eventually started to deteriorate physically. Took a lot of big right hands, and Joe Smith was able to come on and eke out a majority decision. Now, was it a little bit generous? I feel like it was. Vlasov, since then, he beat Valera and lost to, I think, a guy named Solobayev or something like that. So, yeah, he's basically done. But Joe Smith's the champion now, and he's fighting Beterbiev. Beterbiev, one thing I have to say heading into this fight, and the way I feel like is something that's a little bit relevant actually to how he started to fight in recent times. He's become a bit more jab heavy, and he's also started to show slippages in foot speed. He's not the athlete he once was. Early in his career, and a lot of people underestimate this, a lot of people just view Beterbiev to be kind of a come-forward, lumbering pressure fighter. But early in his career, he was much more keen to use his back foot and fight with angles and pivots and an active jab, and also sort of a good left hook on the turn, right hands on the turn, being able to use angles sort of think like an Usyk. But because of the fact that his foot speed has actually declined and he started to step up in competition against guys who can match him in that, he's actually become a bit more crude. And while I think he looked good in the Marcus Brown fight, this isn't This is an Artur Beterbiev, in my opinion, who is a little bit past his physical peak, but still is incredibly dangerous. Joe Smith appears to be in his physical peak, as I feel his stamina and conditioning and his boxing skill, specifically his boxing skill and his ring IQ, have all peaked. And I think this is basically the pinnacle of his career. Coming off of winning a world title, fighting against Steve Giffard, I believe his name is. And the big wins he's had in the runner-up to the Vlasov fight, how determined he is to win this. I believe we're going to see the best version of him. I'm not too sure we're going to see the best version of Beterbiev, but he's still going to be very good. Now, how do I see this fight going? I think Beterbiev is not going to be as jab-heavy, but I think Joe Smith is going to be the one using his jab early on in the fight. Now, what I have to point out for this fight is Beterbiev is someone who rehydrates to the, mid to high 190s, and sometimes around 200 pounds. This was a guy who fought at heavyweight as an amateur, super heavyweight being the highest category, heavyweight being the basically amateur equivalent to cruiserweight in the professionals. So he's a massive light heavyweight. He's someone who, if he were to move up to a light heavyweight, or move up to a cruiserweight, he would basically be able to match. He'd surpass a guy like a Tabiso Machunu in size, but he would be even bigger, probably. He'd probably be very comparable in size to an Alunka Makabu. And he wouldn't be necessarily completely. It wouldn't look like a completely drastic difference in size between he and even a Breedis. So he's a big light heavyweight. He's someone who rehydrates large. And he has the advantage in this fight in brute force, in my opinion. Especially with how Joe Smith has been dogged in the past. The Barrera fight, I can give him a bit of a mulligan with the fact that he got his jaw broken, but Vlasov was really manhandling him a lot and forced him to fight on the back foot. And Beterbiev, who is of similar size, in my opinion, is going to have that advantage. So Joe Smith, from early in the fight, I think he's going to have to push Beterbiev back. And he's going to have to double up on his jab a lot. He's going to need to occupy him to push him back, because he's not going to be able to compete with him going head-to-head. In like a demolition derby collision course. He can't do that. So he's going to have to try to bomb him from long range, keep him occupied, and get his respect early. I see him landing a lot of shots early on Beterbiev. I see this being a very similar fight, actually, to Golovkin versus Murata. Because I think, with the way Murata especially came out, working the body early on the older Golovkin, showing his advantage in hand speed, and a slight advantage in energy, it definitely, as we've seen in recent fights, it takes certainly a bit of time for Beterbiev to get his rhythm and truly get going. But I think Beterbiev has a little bit better jab than Joe Smith. Not significantly, but I do think he has a little bit better jab than Joe Smith. If we watch the Marcus Brown fight, the jab was the key for him, because Marcus Brown was boxing him at long range, and he was using his jab to pierce through Marcus Brown's guard. He was fighting in and out. He still showed some of the foot speed he showed early on in his career, and was able to use his in and out movement to be able to tag him in between his punches. I think he's going to use his body work and his incredibly heavy hands, his perfect record 17-0 with 17 knockouts. And I think he's going to, after a slow start, after maybe being down 2 or 3-0, Joe Smith's going to start to feel the power. I'm not too sure he's going to give Beterbiev a scare, because Beterbiev isn't going to be someone who's upright to get hit bang on the chin. That's a big key. Beterbiev is someone who protects his chin extremely well. So while he might get buzzed, he might feel the power, might feel the pain, he's not going to get concussed from any of the punches. So eventually, Joe Smith, who's going to try to unload on him, he's going to get caught with body shots. Beterbiev's going to slip under his shots, block them, parry them, get underneath with the left hook. And that's going to be a big key. He's eventually going to start to land the right hand over the top of Joe Smith's jab. And I think by around round 7 or 8, Smith's going to be worn down, similarly to how he was in the Vlasov fight. But this time, Beterbiev's not going to let him get away with it. I see him stopping him, maybe scoring a body shot knockdown, but I see him punishing him against the ropes and the referee stepping in to force a stoppage after an exciting first 2 or 3 rounds. That's how I see the fight going. Beterbiev will become a 3-bout unified champion and fully solidify his resume and solidify himself, I'd say, as number 1 in the division. Because even though Bivol beat Canelo, we know Canelo's level in the division now, and now he gets to share a common opponent with Dmitry Bivol, who is now a world champion, who I'd say has improved a little bit since the Bivol fight. And if he really dominates and destroys Joe Smith, like, to be honest, I somewhat expect he does, I would have to put him number 1 on that basis, along with the fact that he has 3 belts. So let's see how the fight goes. Have a good one.